Welcome back to the room. I hope you all find yourselves refreshed. Yes? Good. Excellent. Wonderful. Right. Now, as promised, this second section is going to be more of a Q&A comment section. This is our chance for us, everyone, to get involved. Oh, you've written reams of notes. No. Okay. Reams and reams of notes. I am going to direct this just because we are recording, so before you speak, you will need to have me and my microphone in order that we can capture that for posterity. So if you don't mind waiting on that. I do have a number of people who have come up to me and told me what their comments are. What I was going to say is we'd like to direct it slightly, so we're going to start with a subject, and if you have a comment on that particular subject, then please do put your hands up at that point, and then we'll move on, and hopefully we'll get through everybody before we lose everybody. Has anyone not seen me that has comments that they'd like to... Okay. All right. Excellent. So we've wonderful. I think, though, that what we're going to do is, I found the whole thing incredibly interesting. There were a lot of great takeaway quotes, by the way. You're very quotable, Faiza. Just incredible things that that we'll probably type up and send you all later, or show you sections of the videos once it's been edited. Come on in. Do you want? Oh, okay. Perfect. Okay, so to start with, I think we'll start quite large, and then we'll probably narrow it down. So I'd like to start with Chris Carter. Chris, if I can come to you, because you had quite a broad question, which I think will then lead us nicely down a path of exploration. So if I hand you the mic.
Thanks. So my question to the panel is, how do we deal with both the kind of large global issues like climate change and the demand for more attention towards local issues, as kind of indicated by the most recent election results?
Ella, why don't I let you direct the panel on this one?
Well, Faiza, you've been the one that raised those specific issues, especially in relation to climate change. I mean, yes, we've been talking about Brexit for 3.5 years, but should these things now eclipse that discussion? Are they part of that discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I think the relationship, something that we do need to talk about more is the relationship between the local and the global. So, obviously those global trends are having very, very localized effects as well. And I think that we need to be able to articulate that and talk about that and join those dots. But one thing we also need to do is to talk about what's happening globally. Sometimes I think about, say, something like climate breakdown, which is being felt here, but not to the same degree as other countries. My mum's sister lives in some flats in Karachi, and now she's just got she's having water issues. There was always issues with electricity, and it's always a bit nuts in Karachi, but now in the last few years, she's not been able to get clean water. And that has generated now these gangs that are stealing water and, trying to sell it back in all of the ways. And whenever I talk to people about that story, they're like, oh, in a way, people don't have that humanized story of someone living somewhere else. So I think the ways in which we, it's true that local issues matter, but global issues also matter, is to be able to join those dots and how they're affecting us, but also to tell those human stories. And I find that the emotion, even though I'm got a PhD and do stats and all of those things, the emotional stories, the human stories are what works to really drive points home with people.
I think a lot of it's about thinking about the structure of our democracy in this country, because a lot of people don't feel much connection to their local councillor. They have no idea who their local MP is, never mind who their local councillor is. So I think trying to rebuild those links. One thing I'm a big fan of is the directly elected mayors, which I think give people a very kind of clear and obvious symbol for their local region, someone they can vote for regularly. It's also those combined authorities which give the political heft, to actually do things in a regional sense. So I think they're very important, and giving them a role in Westminster. One idea that's been doing the rounds recently is to scrap the House of Lords and replace it with some kind of chamber that is of the regions and gives a role for local politicians from the devolved parliaments, to make sure they have a clear voice within Westminster. So I think that is very, very important, because one thing that we saw again during the elections and during the Brexit vote was people just not feeling this disconnect from democracy and how it represents them. So that's on the local level. On the kind of national level, I guess it's the same old thing. It's interacting through international bodies. Now, too often these things become talking shops when nothing actually happens. So the WTO, which the government says, yes, we're back as an independent member, and probably no one listens to us or cares what we have to say there. The UN is another example as well that is very dysfunctional, doesn't actually do or achieve a lot of things. things. But I think working with strategic allies is a great example. So the E3 group, which brought together the Iran deal and is still pushing ahead with that despite Trump pulling out. We have clear foreign policy objectives with those countries. And the same with many other mid-tier countries. So I think there's an obvious level of the UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, who can work together on these global issues. Our economies have a lot of similarities. Our societies have a lot of similarities. So I guess, in a way, that's something very much for Westminster politicians to look at. But clearly, I think it's that link in between that we need to focus on first.
Claire?
So I don't think that bringing democratic accountability home means turning your back on international issues. And I think that sometimes people think it's a kind of Little Englander response, and that when you say you want to leave a transnational organisation, it's because you're actually not interested in the world. I don't think that's what has happened, because I think that with large global issues, one still needs to be able to hold your own politicians to account for decisions they make about global issues like climate change or war or foreign policy or any of these things. So I don't, in a way, I don't see it as a retreat to local. I think it's quite straightforwardly a way of saying we want to hold you to account, rather than being told that a transnational organisation that you have no power over makes decisions because it says these are big global issues and therefore you are not allowed to criticise them because it's been decided somewhere else. And just the only other thing to say is that sometimes localism can seem as though it's the solution. You know, power's closer to you and local councils and all that, and I'm, very keen on local democracy. But I think you can also make the mistake, because certainly where I'm from in Wales, there's actually a Welsh Parliament, the Senedd, and it's about as close to the people of Wales as the moon. I mean, it's got absolutely no instinctive relationship with anybody in Wales. It's consistently argued before the referendum that the people of Wales would never vote to leave, and then they overwhelmingly voted to leave. And since then, they've kept voting through that they are a Remain Parliament, despite the fact that nobody's changed their minds in Wales. So, just because you're physically close, if you have an outlook, political outlook, which has contempt for local people, I mean, what good's that, is my point. So it's not a physical, it can't be solved technically. That's all.
Brilliant. I'd like to then, sort of bringing it closer to home, but still on those sorts of issues, turn to Helen. Helen, where are you? Helen, now you were opening a huge can of worms with your question, but let's go for it.
I'm just going to ask a question about Northern Ireland. What do the panel think is going to happen with Northern Ireland and the peace process? Because Brexit is hugely problematic. Britain and Ireland, in my view, have to maintain a very, very close relationship. So fuck your sovereignty, effectively. I think you ought to have stayed within the European Union to maintain a good relationship with the Irish Republic.
Well, you've directed that very specifically to Claire, but I'll throw...
Well, Claire's from the Brexit party, so I feel that Claire is the most lever
of
the group.
Ella, shall we throw that
Yeah,
back?
well, let's let Claire briefly respond,
Okay.
and I'm sure other people in the audience will have points. Claire, do you want to come back on anything to do with the Irish question?
I do not
Quickly.
think that the peace process is jeopardised by Brexit. The people of Ireland, well, first of all, there is a general election going on in the south of Ireland, as we know, and Varadkar, who has been the person who's most put that forward, looks like he's going to lose his seat for a start off. So I think things are slightly more complicated. I think that also the state of politics in Northern Ireland, which was in a mess anyway, actually recently has got its act together, and there's been some very interesting things that happened in the general election in Northern Ireland. Actually, if you can say nothing else about Brexit, it certainly stirred up political loyalties, and some tribalism has been challenged. All sorts of peculiar things happened with the DUP not doing very well, Sinn Féin actually losing out to a new party called the Alliance, or the Alliance Party having an upsurge. Party. No, having an upsurge as a new party that matters, let's put it that way. And I simply think that the people of Ireland do have some sense of what national self-determination means. And they might not support Brexit, but they would at least recognise that sovereignty is not fuck sovereignty, but it's something which has animated Irish politics for many years. And I support their right to self-determination, like I support the right of those people who voted for self-determination in the referendum in 2016.
Does anyone else have a comment to make about Ireland? Well, hang on, wait, we're going to stick with Ireland for now, because I know that somebody else, you had a conversation with someone from the Northern Ireland that in this room, but they've gone to the bar. True to. Would you like to comment on this? Do you have a viewpoint? No. Shall we move? All right. No, that's fine. No, that's always the case with in-laws, isn't it? Would you like to comment on Ireland? Hang on one moment. You need to take the mic from me.
Just a very brief comment, which is that I always find it slightly dispiriting that the default view in the UK is that the response of the Irish people in the north will be to just take up arms at the first sign of any inconvenience. That's my only view.
Seb, you have a point.
Just to come back to your point about Northern Ireland here, as someone who thought very, very hard about that referendum decision, and one of the reasons that I voted Remain was because I felt very strongly about the Union and about Scotland, which you mentioned and which we'll come on to. And I felt that's something I grew up very near the border with Scotland, and it's something I feel very passionately about, that I don't want it to fall apart. And I think that it's been very successful economically and socially for a long time. And I think Northern Ireland has been treated quite badly throughout this whole Brexit process by the government. And essentially Boris Johnson has shafted Northern Ireland to a certain extent, and how that pans out is going to be very, very difficult to keep it within the United Kingdom. But the fact is, I don't think it's inevitability that we'll have a united Ireland. Some people say it is. Demographics may point in that direction. But until we get to that point of a border poll becoming a reality, I think it's very much up for grabs. And nobody's really making the case for the union at the moment. No one's giving the arguments about why having all these countries working together to dilute what I would call the worst parts of national sovereignty with this British identity is fundamentally a very good thing. So the one thing I want to see over the coming year and years is people to talk up the union and to talk about why Britishness is a good thing, because it's been entirely forgotten. We began to have that conversation in 2014 with the Scottish independence referendum. The whole thing was then just dropped after we had that vote. I think that's a big, big shame for our politics.
Sorry. Yeah. So I think you're right. It was absolutely squandered by Brexit. Basically, we had a chance, I guess, after the Scottish referendum to talk about the union. And I don't think it's simplistic for Ireland to be united. I come from an Irish Catholic nationalist background, but I can see there's lots of reasons why people in Northern Ireland would not want to be united with the rest of the island, and it would be better to maintain the union with Britain. But I think this is under huge jeopardy because of Brexit and because of border controls.
Faiza's
Yeah,
had a
just
small
I mean,
point.
this is one of the ways in which Brexit isn't done, because we don't know. You know, essentially what Seb says, like they threw Northern Ireland under the bus, really. I mean, or DUP at least, and we don't know what the arrangements will look like and what political consequences will be of that. Now, I spent loads of time in Northern Ireland a few years ago on a project looking at poverty and inequality in Northern Ireland. And working with one of the government departments there, and I went round and did loads of focus groups. And the thing that people don't understand here often is how different it is to the rest of the UK and how it is like a post-conflict society. You know, people are really sensitive, and there's still, it wasn't that long ago. And so I think it's, you know, you can't pretend like you know. I think I think we just don't know what's going to happen there, and a lot of things are possible because it's people don't understand Northern Ireland in the rest of the UK. I find.
But can I?
So then you go ahead.
Well, the only thing is that well, first of all, there's been a lot more discussion about Northern Ireland in recent years since Brexit than there was before. Some people in the UK seem to have only just discovered there is a border. That border is actually a peculiarly contentious border. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that people are talking about it. I agree with this point that it doesn't mean that there's about to be an armed conflict. I think that the way that Ireland was used, however, in the Brexit discussion, post the referendum, was to say, you voted the wrong way, now you're going to lead to war in Ireland. And this proves that Brexit is a stupid idea. And it does mean change. There will be things thrown into the air. And you can't say that people voted the wrong way because it has consequences, unknown consequences yet, as to what will happen. So my feeling is that this is using the Irish situation inappropriately. And not, one of the reasons why I became passionate about the EU issue was because of the way the EU treated the Irish in 2 referendums when they told them that they were stupid and they ought to go back and vote again. And they actually described them as not understanding. I mean, all of the terms that were used about Brexit voters were used about the Irish. I'm from an Irish family. I was unbelievably annoyed about what happened. And one of the people I agreed with on that was Jeremy Corbyn, who made a fantastic speech on the eve of the second Irish referendum. He made that very point that, don't put your placards away because they're going to keep coming back until they ground you down until you say the right thing. And that made me realise what the democratic deficit was in the EU, which made me think that if there was ever a referendum, I was going to vote to leave. So ironically, I was inspired by the Irish people voting against the imposition of the EU to vote for this. So the idea that people are now going to wander around lecturing me about I've never thought about the Irish situation is preposterous. Of course, no. I've been lectured by a number of people.
One very, very tiny quick point. Just these issues about the future of the Union, don't blame Brexit, because the fact is these issues existed before the Brexit vote, and the vast majority of England voted to leave, the majority of Northern Ireland voted remain, Wales voted leave, and the fact is those 4 constituent nations had very different views on this topic, and it's because of the lack of care given to the Union that the British identity has been strained by the different way that they voted. And I do hope when we start talking about the Union, we can acknowledge that we can have those different views within a cohesive United Kingdom. I'm done now.
Okay, brilliant. We have so many other comments that I'd like to move us forward. David, do you want to go next?
I wanted to slightly change the topic and to get off Brexit and to think about the future of our politics in this country. And one of the things I think might happen is the Conservatives remain in power for the next 30 years, because I can't actually see a credible opposition. I think the Liberal Democrats have never really looked like a national party, and I think the Labour Party has completely lost its way. And I'm not sure that it's just a case of, working class people lending their votes to the Tory party, because actually Scotland, which used to be a huge base for the Labour Party, is completely gone. No one in Scotland, which is a kind of sort of lefty place, votes Labour anymore. I'm sort of exaggerating for effect, but they've got no MPs. I think they've got 1 MP left in Scotland, if I'm right. So it's to me, there isn't actually a coherent opposition. And Faiza, when you were talking about, people are sick of austerity and all the rest of it, that might be true. But people voted Tory, the party that you would say has inflicted austerity. They voted for it. The people you would say have suffered from austerity voted for it. They didn't vote for the Labour Party. So what I'd like to hear from the whole panel, I don't know what you would vote. You're not presumably going to carry on voting for the Brexit Party, because that party has achieved its purpose. But what's your political role? What would you like to see? I mean, you might actually think that the Tory party... I'm one of the few people who met Boris Johnson for the first time when he was standing for president of the Oxford Union. And I kind of think he's someone who knows how to get elected. He got elected as president of the Oxford Union. He got elected as mayor of London when he's a Labour mayor. So you might think... And I actually agree that he's kind of lives for himself. I really think that. I think he loves winning. But there's something tremendously likeable about him. You might say, I just like him so much, but then people vote for him time and time again. And I think the Labour Party, who just thinks he's a toff and talk about him being in part of the Bullingdon Club, why do they not recognise this man has got this extraordinary popular mandate in spite of his faults, or maybe because of his faults? He seems human. I mean, I bet everyone, if we put up their hands and said, would you rather go for a drink with Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn? I mean, I know what I would prefer. Go for Jeremy. Go for Jeremy. Well, you. No, but it's about how you get elected. I was using that as a shorthand, as how you get elected. You get elected, by seeming someone that people find likeable, and that is the issue. And it's not the Labour Party. I look at those candidates for the leadership. Dreary Keir Starmer. I mean, dreary Keir Starmer, dreary Long Bailey. I mean, honestly, they're not going to be inspirational leaders. These are not people like, I mean, Michael Foot is someone from where I come from. He was a first-class intellectual. He had charisma. You know, Kinnock had charisma. He could have been elected. Blair, he's now in the Labour Party a kind of pariah figure. He won 3 elections. No one, if Blair came here, no Labour activist would want to be seen with him. And I just think it's amazing that there is no opposition to the Tories at the moment. So one of the things I'm worried about our democracy, whether you're for the Tory party or against the Tory party, is it might become like Japan, where there's just basically the same party gets elected year after year after year after year. So I'd like the panel to say whether that view is possible, dismal, not going to happen. What do they see about opposition parties?
Okay, sticking with that, before we go back to the panel, just get another one. I know that you had a question about proportional representation, so can we add that to that as we're going to move into a discussion about the current political climate and how to change it?
Yeah, it's just a genuine question because I don't know the answer. If we had had proportional representation for the Brexit vote, what would the outcome have been?
Okay, so what we have is 2 comments here. Does anyone else have a comment on this sort of subject before we throw back to the panel, because they've spoken quite a lot? We're talking about realistically going forward, do we see a 2-party system? And of course, looking at proportional representation with specific regards to the Brexit Party. Anyone else? Okay, one more. Oh, sorry. I see you. You had a comment?
Yes.
Also for this?
Well, because you mentioned about the political parties, I think the Brexit Party, basically the Brexit, the first thing it did, it made 2 parties irrelevant. That's the first thing we noticed. It was the duality was not about Labours and Conservatives. It was about nationalism, sovereignty versus globalization. And that's what, after Brexit, one, I like to know what happens. What is the Brexit? Is there any relevance? Can Brexit Party be a vehicle itself now? You use Tories as a vehicle, but now it seems the Brexit's, the purpose has been served. And I really like to see that global dimension coming out of Brexit. And I don't really think there is any Labour Conservative left. Should be Brexit Party versus global party, something like that.
Okay, great. Let's get another comment back here, and then we will throw back to the panel for what you've asked.
A lot of what's been spoken about has been about voice and being heard. And on this proportional representation, I just sort of want to ask, how do you think the results of this latest general election would have differed had it been proportional representation over first past the post? And I very much enjoyed David's question, actually, about sort of what comes next. And I mean this particularly for the Brexit Party, without a single MP, what would you like to see come next? That's a very important question for me.
Okay, and I'll take one more comment from the front, and then we'll let the panel deal with all of those comments together.
It was exactly the same.
Oh. Incredible. All right. Well, I'll throw back to Ella to deal with all of those.
And also recognise that no one is actually on the panel an MP at the moment. So please feel free to bend the party line or sway away from it if you want to. Faiza was particularly something about the future of an opposition. Maybe you want to tell me.
No, listen. The Labour Party has a lot of work to be done, a lot of work to do. I mean, a lot in all kinds of ways. And, the arithmetic given Scotland is very difficult for Labour now. And they really have to think about, how they do put forward a platform of, say, proportional representation. They, at least in the next election, come together with the other parties that might support that. Because right now, the vote for progressives or the left is split, whereas on the right it isn't. So that the Conservatives are able to kind of bring together a large rump of people, whereas even in my seat had like 600-700 people less voted Lib Dem and voted for me. If there had been a Brexit Party, I would have won if it stood in my seat. So that's the arithmetic of our particular political system. And there's actually really good arguments to be made for how archaic and wrong our political system is right now, the first past the post system. And I haven't supported it for a long time. Proportional representation is certainly something we should be moving towards. So I think the Labour Party has to embrace some of this and has to think more strategically about alliances simply because the arithmetic is not there. And I think there will be. I think we're assuming that everything will just go swimmingly for the Tories now, and they've got this majority. That's just not how. This is not how things work. You know, things happen. Whether it be some kind of global glitch that means that the economy's hit, whether it be that a deal isn't reached with the EU, or it's much harder to get trade deals with other countries than we think. There will be crises that happen, and to some extent, the ability for Labour to stand up in those moments and have something to say and to fight for, and actually be right. Have a positive vision going forward, and these are all of the things that need to get sorted out. And despite what some of your views are about charisma, we have a very narrow idea of what power looks like. We're on our 20th Etonian Prime Minister. It's in this country. I did this show, and I did the number crunching for this show a few years ago called "Will We Ever Have a Black Prime Minister" on BBC Two, and it was so striking to me how, and then this is happening kind of in the Labour Party right now. Keir Starmer is like a safe hands, and ultimately he looks like power, and so I think we need to push back on some of that. Boris Johnson is an idea of power. He's an Etonian Oxbridge, which happens a lot. I don't play into that, but it is important that the Labour Party makes that argument and demonstrates what others who don't fit within that have to offer this country, and that having a prime minister that is more representative of this country, whether it be class, in particular whether it be class, is a good thing. So I think, I'm not going to, there's so much to sort out in the Labour Party, I can't even tell you.
Well, just to pick up on a couple of those points there, I've sort of just this thing about keep going on about, there was Richard Bergen during the election said Boris Johnson is a Tory in case you'd forgotten. I was like, how could you forget he's a Tory? He obviously is there. But he does a very clever thing because he is a Conservative. But if you go back to that Oxford Union election you mentioned, how did he win that election? He won it by running as an SDP candidate.
He told me, yes, he was president of the Oxford University Conservative Association, but I was SDP in those days, and he said we were political soulmates.
Exactly.
But maybe people will start seeing through that. I just hope.
Oh, what, 50 years into his life?
No, but they did in London. By the time that he finished, I don't know, that's 8 years, but people in London were really annoyed about the Garden Bridge and all of, actually people were really angry with him in London. He wasn't popular by the end, so maybe people
He would have won a third term in London.
Okay.
But the point I want to make is, that he does wear political clothing quite lightly, even though he is a Conservative. And as you said, that contradiction back when he was a student, being head of the Conservative Society and standing on an SDP platform. Now, he's head of a Conservative party, running very unconservative policies, a lot of left-wing economic stuff that wouldn't have happened under David Cameron, certainly wouldn't have happened under Margaret Thatcher. And I think that's how he has this appeal that goes much wider than a traditional Conservative leader. For the Labour Party, I think you just can't stress how bad it is for Labour at the moment. It's far worse than 1983. In 1983, they held on to a lot of their provincial heartlands. They held on to a core base in Scotland. Scotland is gone. Labour has very likely will get absolutely erased in Northern England if it doesn't fix itself at the next election. And I think there is a case to be made that Labour is one election away from total extinction, because at the moment it represents cities, university towns, and that's it. Like, there's very little else that the Labour Party speaks to. And this conversation it's having about White lost the election, it's a joke.
What percentage young people vote Conservative?
Right, very small proportion, but how does that, people as they get older become more conservative? And there's the point that I just want to make about where Labour is until it takes seriously why it lost that election, which is, yes, Brexit had a lot to do with it, but a most spectacularly unpopular leader. He went into that election, the most unpopular leader of a political party ever since polls began, and yet they still think he's the messiah amongst the party's membership and would keep him leader.
Okay, we're moving to Claire. It's Claire next. No, wait, Claire's. It is, but it's not a free for all, my lovely. It's not a free for all.
Okay,
so,
no, of course I'm very happy to take
so we're going
to.
We're going to move to Claire to answer that. We're going to move to Claire.
I love an unruly crowd, but can we just let Claire make
Claire's
a point?
Claire's going to answer that. I've seen your hand, but we do have other people in front of you.
Okay, so I do think that the Labour Party is in serious trouble, but so does Pfizer, and most people know that. And the point about the Scottish example, I think, is worth noting, which is, you know, when I spent a lot of time in Scotland, the Labour Party absolutely dominated. It was a fiefdom. You couldn't move for Labour Party apparatchiks, in my view. They weren't particularly impressive, but they bloody well ran everything. I never thought that I'd see the collapse of Labour in Scotland, and they've gone, and they're unlikely to be back there. So, but what you can also say is that that's a trend throughout Europe. So what I would say to those people in the Tories who think they've got a 30-year reign is there is something is happening that goes beyond Brexit or what's happening in the UK, which is there is a international shake-up of traditional political parties, not just in Europe, which is a kind of kickback against technocracy, as it's been described, and so on. And the Tory party is as stuffed full as technocrats as anyone else, let me tell you, and it might need to think about that. You know, we're making it sound as though Boris Johnson is the Tory party. Until 6 months ago, in fact, before the Brexit party, it was Theresa May, and Theresa May would still be running the Tory party if it hadn't been for what happened in the European elections. And they had no instinct whatsoever of self-preservation. They managed to absolutely destroy their own base themselves and got humiliated in those European elections. So the idea that the Conservatives are on a winning streak for 30 years and they got it so badly wrong only so recently is actually not very honest or serious politically. I mean, I think about what's happening in France at the moment, you know, and it's a little bit like what the elites are like everywhere, which you've got President Macron, you know, floating around, you know, the hero, by the way, of the EU, but the hero of the kind of European elite, and they're kind of like self-confidence brimming with ideas and all the rest of it, and kind of greeted by everyone as a wonderful example of European enlightenment and what a person... Anyway, there's civil war on the streets of France, in case anyone hasn't noticed, right? You know, never mind the Gilets jaunes, the strike, the fact that the police are going in and beating the hell out of the fire service. You know, it wants the emergency services stop kicking the hell out of each other that way. Not getting much publicity here, but that's what's happening. And somehow they're kind of like, everyone says, but as Macron says, and you think, for God's sake, look at what's happening. So I think the Tories' idea that they can kind of like just wander in and rule for 30 years is mistaken. But it's also the case that it's not given that there will be a straightforward opposition. People have asked about the Brexit Party, and you know the answer to this. The Brexit Party has no roots. It did not form in a traditional way that a party formed. It was a one-off, out of the blue, worked well, and people had aspirations to take the Brexit Party forward that were well and truly, you know, given short shrift in the general elections, perfectly reasonably. But what I know happened as well is that that slogan, which I know I keep saying it's a slogan, but it's more than that, the change politics for good, was that all over the Northwest, certainly, but actually everywhere I've gone, there are new activists who've emerged. And I always say it reminds me of the miners' strike, when miners' wives groups formed. People who've never been involved in politics are now organisers. They've got a taste for it. And they are all ex-Labour, and they're never going back to Labour. And lots of them are young, Faiza, by the way. Lots of them are young. They're not, by any stretch of the imagination, white. Funny enough, quite a lot of them are European, all sorts of people, i.e. people, right? And they're kind of there going, right, I want to organise a new movement. What are we going to do? Now, the Brexit Party is unlikely to be it. We can all work that bit out. But it's sowed the seeds of something. And I'm ever hopeful that new movements will emerge and we should experiment until they break through.
Great. We're running out of time, so I'm going to move it on slightly. You had a comment to make? Your comment, please.
Sorry, I wrote something down. Because, Claire, I think you made such an important point that you said kind of we're not allowed to think aloud anymore. And I think that's really, really true. I think politicians are really frightened of saying the wrong thing, being thrown out, what the headlines are going to be. However, and this isn't directed at you, it's directed to kind of in general, I do find it really deeply disturbing that we have white people constantly saying that things aren't racist. And I think, Faiza, you were completely right when you said it does seem at the moment that being called a racist is worse than being on the receiving end of actual racism. Last weekend, Katie Hopkins was removed from Twitter, right? Quite rightly, in my opinion, okay? And she was removed after the brilliant Rachel Riley and the Centre for Digital Hate went to Twitter and showed them all of the vile anti-Semitic comments she's been making. if you've had a chance to look at her Twitter feed over the years, she has been constantly making comments that are anti-Islam, that are anti-black community. Yet she was taken off Twitter not for those reasons. And I think that is a very clear indication of where we are right now. And I think that most people in this room who are white, I think it is also our responsibility, all of us. I'm white, I'm privileged, I admit that. We have to stand up and we have to call out every single moment of racism. And I don't sit here and we don't have a right to say that's not racist.
Thank you for that comment. I think we'll keep it moving. I don't feel that it needs a response directly from the panel. Related.
Well, except I disagree.
Well, I just want to get more.
There might be other people in the audience who
Yes, I'd like to get more responses from the audience. Anyone directly on that comment? No white person wants to talk now. They're all too scared. It's just me and Faiza leading forward.
We will see a time that we call someone you are white, that would be an offense.
Okay, let me get that into the microphone one more time.
I think very soon we will see a time that you call someone you white, that would be an offense.
I think we saw that on Question Time with Lawrence Fox. Yeah, we just saw that.
Jon Snow's comment got the most complaints about, like, I've never seen so many white people at a Brexit rally or something. Got the most complaints to Ofcom last year.
So all right. Also on this subject?
Yeah.
Oh, yep.
Yeah, I think the reason that people feel very strongly about being called racist is because racism is taken very seriously. In the same way that you can't call someone a paedophile and expect them to just say, oh yeah, that's me, I should change my ways. I mean, it's a reflection of how seriously we take society and how hated racism is. And, you know, it's interesting that you just mentioned the Jon Snow comment. I don't think it's racist to talk about white people in that way. I don't think he was making a racist remark or anything like that. And a lot of people say that's bollocks. But it was a sneering remark. It was singling out those white people. It was racializing a certain group of people as white, presumably because they're working class. And, you know, so the way we use race is quite complicated. And the way, you know, we bandy around racial epithets, and we always use it to other. And that is, you know, we're not, obviously, white people do not face racism in any meaningful way. But clearly there is a kind of othering going on there when people use that word in an insulting way.
Comment on race? Not yet? All right. One more comment on race?
So just one little comment on the white Jon Snow remark. I mean, you could argue that the Remain campaign was always full of white people too. So, and that was an argument made against them as well. You could argue that both Leave and Remain were dominated by white people.
That's because we do live in a country that's dominated
by white people. So, yeah.
It's unfortunate, I know, for some people to note this, but
I agree with Claire that we should lose the word gammon. I think that is a racialised word, an insult, actually.
But could I just come back on, just very quick, because I know that the two things. First of all, I've got my bête noire in the whole world is Kate Hopkins. I can't stand her, but I use her as a good example to test my free speech, because I defend Katie Hopkins' free speech. I hate her, I despise her, and I particularly, the idea that we would ask, for example, a multinational tech organisation like Twitter to police her even scares me even more. So that's one thing. And secondly, I do think it is an obligation on all of us, regardless of our skin colour, to say what we believe to be true. And if I hear somebody called a racist, and I don't believe they're a racist, the idea that I'm not going to say anything because I'm white is actually a tyranny. It's actually going to lead to dishonest, bad faith politics, and it's actually what's happened. And so now what happens is we don't have conversations. I think it's absolutely insulting. I can see racism. And somebody can argue that it's not racist or it is racist, but it's got absolutely nothing to do with my skin colour. And if people think that the only people who can talk about racism is because of skin colour, it's the end of rational politics.
I think, can I just say, I just want to say that, like, what happens with this conversation about racism is that we very quickly descend into a defence. And I just was talking to someone in the kitchen of, again, like, it's a defensive thing. Why can't we just take the time to listen to people that are experiencing it, you know, and and take on that there is prejudice in our society, that we all have prejudices. We are socialized in a certain way. You know, my husband is an actor, he looks Middle Eastern. The amount of times that he gets roles that say Middle Eastern looks mean, that's his character. That's what they constantly tell us about people that look like him. I can tell you, script after script, I've saved them for when I write the book. You know, it's like, it's ridiculous. So let's not just act defensively all the time, like, oh, I'm an anti-racist. And, you know, Jeremy Corbyn did this a bit with the anti-Semitism. Like, let's listen, let's accept that there are some problems, and let's see it, and not just take it really personally all the time. And that's the thing that's so frustrating about the conversation about race, is that you know, you're made to feel like you've done something wrong by even mentioning it. You know, I got attacked on the election day. I got tweeted that we want Chingford back. I got, you know, it's constant. Katie Hopkins retweeted something I said, and that day I was absolutely constant. Like the trolls, my Twitter was insane. I blocked 300 accounts that day, and it was horrific. So, you know, free speech has, you know, that kind of free speech, Katie Hopkins' free speech, has real consequences for some people. Mm-hmm. And let's just understand that and accept that, and say that some of that is not okay, because I shouldn't have had to deal with that day.
Just to sort of tie these two things together, and this is more a question for you, Claire, than a point, is, you know, Katie Hopkins, for me, strays from free speech into hate speech. Now, do you, first of all, do you accept the concept of hate speech? Because I know some people don't and say that, you know, everything has to be up for debate and what have you. But if you look consistently at what Katie Hopkins has said, the views she's put forward, I think most people could make a judgment that that is hate speech. And I take the view of those multinational platforms, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, they're publishers in the same way that newspapers are publishers. They don't accept it, but I think they have to accept that. And that they have to take responsibility for stuff that is published on their platform. And then they therefore do have to make that decision, because otherwise it is just a free-for-all.
I think that hate speech should be defended under the auspices of free speech. And who defines what is hate speach? It might be clear with Katie Hopkins.
Is a great topic for another symposium. We have time for 3 comments. So I have 3 hands. Ali. Yes, I do. Sorry. Yes. Use the microphone.
Just 2 comments, really. One was something, Faiza, I just wanted to pick up on what you said about Boris being an old Etonian. I think this is sort of indicative of a problem that the left have, which is judging people by what they are rather than what they actually stand for. So it's a bit like, you know, saying...
I was making a point about what power looks like and what we think power
No, I
looks
understand,
like.
but the point, that there's also been a lot of talk about the next Labour Party leader should be a woman, just automatically. Now, that may or may not be the case, depending on who the best candidate is. But there's very little about the best candidate and more about this identity politics thing. That's one thing. The other thing I just wanted to sort of ask was that in all this Labour leadership debate, the one thing that hasn't come through to me is that the Labour Party has actually understood in any way that immigration was a part of the reason why people voted to leave the EU. Because they wanted to control free movement and put in place controls on an immigration system. I thought Lisa Nandy got that for about 2 weeks until she then said she was in favour of free movement. So the Labour Party just seems to be in complete denial about this issue. And it's not just an economic issue, it's also a cultural one. People feel that the country changed too rapidly. We went from 50,000 in 97 a year net immigration to 250 by the time Labour left. And people feel that the numbers are too high. Will the left accept, or can the left come to terms with the fact that many of its erstwhile supporters consider this to be a serious issue, that what they want tackled?
Thank you. Okay, save that for closing statements.
I think going back to the first part of the discussion, but trying to push it on, I actually do think when someone said that Brexit has really shaken everything and thrown it up in the air, and we're not quite sure how things are going to settle. So let me give you an example of what I mean. We're in for a time of incoherence, and incoherence in politics is quite a good thing. So let me tell you about my own thoughts, because I don't know where to go. So on the one hand, I've spent most of my life in England, been here 25 years, at so many anti-racist demonstrations and initiatives and campaigns, but I absolutely want to defend the right of people to hate, if they wish. I want to defend absolute free speech, 100%, I'm with Claire. But Claire, I really like I really, really like what you say about class. And inequality is a big issue for me. I want a redistribution of wealth and I want growth. So that would maybe bring me towards you. But guess what? I voted Brexit. But I wouldn't go down to Parliament Square because I was a bit uncomfortable with all the Union Jacks. And guess what? I'm delighted that Brexit's probably going to move a United Ireland closer. I like the breakup of the Union. Now, that is incoherence. And then, on the other hand, I'm worried about where the Labour Party's going with identity politics, because I'm a universalist and I want to hark back to that old left-wing idea of universalism, which seems to be lost. And Faiza, that point that you brought up, which everybody forgot about stabbings, I've taught last year in Tottenham, and I want to talk about stabbings, but I think half the problem is material deprivation. But I don't like it when people just say cuts, because I think part of the problem is cultural deprivation and dysfunctional families and other things. And we shouldn't be afraid to talk about both at the same time. So when you throw all that up in the air, I don't know where I stand. And what I would like is a new type of politics where we can say honestly what we really think. And I just want to repeat, I so much of what Claire says, but Faiza, I absolutely love some of what you say. And so what does that make me?
Okay, last comment, and then we'll throw back to the panel for closing.
Thanks very much. I was going to ask a question, but I'll turn it into a comment. I mean, the question was really whether there's any subject that the panelists think should not be discussed, or any particular person or group that they would not want to engage in civilized conversation with, even if it were possible. And I think it links obviously to what Claire was saying about Brexit and tribalism and mutual accusations, because those accusations were mutual. Remainers had funny ideas about leavers, just as leavers did about remainers. But I think to broaden it onto the point about free speech, I think there is a bridge here. And what is the division between free speech and hate speech? I think there's a lot of muddle on all sides of this, and it's very hard to unpick. The question, is this free speech or hate speech, is misleading, because it could be both. I mean, it could be hate speech, which is freely made. And then, of course, the moral question is whether it should be freely made and what are the moral boundaries on it. It links to the question of whether there are undiscussable subjects, because in the first discussion, Faiza said, I don't want to talk about racism, or it was phrased in such a way, it's not up for discussion.
It's up for debate.
Yeah, okay, not up for, exactly, yeah.
Now that's racism's okay or racism's not okay.
Sure,
I mean,
exactly,
if that was a debate question. I mean,
understood in one way, you're saying it's not up for debate. I want to say that really, we have to think very carefully before we say things aren't up for debate or things should not be aired, partly because people have a sense of suppressed rage if they feel that they have to mind their language all the time or mind their expression, and so they end up saying very stilted things. But on the other side of this, which I do recognise as being equally important, I think the white privilege point is not entirely misplaced, because there is such a thing as bias. And when Lawrence Fox said on Question Time, I can't help the fact that I'm white and privileged, that was an irrelevant answer. I mean, the question was actually asking, don't you possibly have a bias because you're white and so on? And that wasn't picked up. We have to, the narrow path to tread in this is to say, yeah, let's have a discussion about what racism actually is. Let's make it quite a difficult discussion, but let's also recognise that we all have biases and that some words can be harmful, leaving open the question of where the threshold is when you start saying words should be banned. So a rather convoluted comment, but there it is.
I'll throw back to you for closing comments from the panel.
Yes, okay. So guys, don't feel like you have to answer all the questions. There was a lot going on there, but I think we should go in reverse order. So I'll start with you, Faiza, and anything you want to leave the audience with, thoughts-wise.
Yeah, so just, I mean, the incoherence. You know, a lot of people feel that way. A lot of people aren't like wedded to a political party or in a box in that way. And, the best conversations I had with people were where you were able to connect on particular issues. And ultimately, some of it is about whether they like you or not, and whether they think that you'll care about them and their families. So I think, you're not unusual, although it's a good combination of things. I mean, we don't have a denial that immigration was a problem for people. That denial isn't there. But it's not my values to argue against immigration. I'm not saying that I think we should have open borders, but it's not my values. It's not where a lot of people in the Labour Party are to put immigration controls on our mugs again. That's not where we are. So there's a difference there. We're not saying that people don't think it's a problem. What we're saying is we will make a different argument because we believe in something different. And we're not making the argument well enough, of course, but there isn't a denial that immigration is a problem and for some Labour voters and part of why Brexit happened. You know, I haven't done a talk since the election, well, apart from like Labour Party meetings, that doesn't count. But, you know, partly because I've wanted to sort of stew on things a bit and just sort of pull myself together, because it's a lot when you stand in an election and you fight someone like Ian Duncan Smith, and it was, you know, it taught me a lot about politics and how toxic things are and but how wonderful things are as well. And I guess the thought I want to leave you with is, you know, you spoke, Claire, about these activists that you saw come up, you know, people that had never been involved before. There's a yin to a yang, you know. I had people, hundreds of people turning up in Chingford and Woodford Green, and we'd ask them every time, have you ever done anything like this before? And almost always, a third to a half would put their hands up, and they weren't Labour members. And they were coming because they stood for a particular set of values that they could see in me, that they didn't like the kinds of policies that had been put in place, in particular for me and Duncan Smith, especially towards disabled people and sick people that have struggled a lot with some of the welfare reforms that he made. So, you know, it can feel like, for us on progressives, the worst of times. But there are also people coming through. There are also people that are very angry about the result. We had a thank you party on Sunday, and I was shocked. I turned up a few minutes later. There was 120 people that had turned up, you know, the vast majority of which I didn't know 18 months ago, even a year ago. You know, the local doctor, the local shop owner, the girl that's like talking to me on the bus. Like, it's, you know, so those things can change, but the Labour Party does, and I know this because I just fought an election and saw just what a mess the rest of it was. You know, does have a lot of work to do, but it's not all lost.
Okay, thanks. We'll save all our claps for the end. Seb.
I think, again, I have to come back to Mr. Incoherence here, because you've captured so much, everything of the past 4 or 5 years of British politics there, that people have these very conflicting ideas. They have traditional identities, they have new identities, and when you come to an election, you have no choice but to fit and to make choices about who is best going to speak to that, you know. And it's whether your heart is with part of Faiza here and your head is with part of Claire here. That makes it very difficult about which way you would go in that. And I think those things aren't going to change, because we are in this age where a lot of these topics, these things about free speech, are not new topics, but they're being debated openly in a way that I don't think has necessarily happened for quite a long time. And that is an exciting thing, right? Because we are putting these things forward here, and we do have the opportunity. And of course, we shouldn't forget, the big thing that's changed recently in politics has been about social media. It's been about, it's much easier to interact and debate with politics. There's more platforms, and it's more open in a way than it ever was before. If you take Momentum, for example, that's brought thousands of young people into politics where they never would have. Same the Brexit Party as well, obviously of a very different persuasion. But those are two things that 5 years ago never existed. And I think fundamentally, for someone like me who loves politics and does think that politicians are all trying to do the right thing, there's very few exceptions in there, this is a good thing. People are more engaged with these issues than I think they were in the past. But I think this idea, you know, I'm going to push back on myself here. When I say we return to normal, that's that we talk about more domestic things. But I think the way we do politics has changed fundamentally. That is not going back. And is it better or worse than the way things were done 10, 20 years ago? I guess you'll have to look at where the country is. You'll have to see what things actually get done, what policies change, and where the parties come on the other side of this, because these are big issues. And of course, we're not in a vacuum here. That the free speech thing, to come to your point about hate speech, is something that's wildly contested in America as well. And obviously, Donald Trump takes a different approach, I'd say, to Boris Johnson, how he talks to the media and the kind of language that he uses there. There may be some similarities, but it's not really been tested in the UK, I think, to the same extent that it has in America. We're very lucky in the way that Ofcom works, that we don't have impartiality in TV journalism. But I think we may get to a point where free speech is tested to a much greater extent about this line of what is and isn't hate speech. I'm very happy to draw a line. And if that does include some curbs on freedom of speech because of hate speech, fine. I'm happy to take that cost others may not be. But I think for a kind of cohesive society, that is a price worth paying. But generally speaking, I just think the whole thing at the beginning to start is kind of exciting and is really, really interesting about where the Tories go, what political clothing they're going to wear, what Boris Johnson's going to look like come the next election, come after that, and where the Labour Party goes. I think one thing I forgot to say before is that, yes, things go wrong for governments all the time. Like, just look at the events of the past 2 weeks, that, you know, the government's in this imperial phase at the moment where it thinks it can do and say what it likes and get its way on everything since it's got an 8-seat majority. That won't always be the case. That will be challenged, and I think Labour probably will start to revive in some form, and where that goes will reshape things too. So it's a great time, that's what I think.
Okay, thank you, Seb. Claire?
I think it is very exciting, and I do think that there has been a massive injection of life and energy into democracy in the UK, and that's why what I thought Brexit always was, but the irony is that because it was denied in 2016, it kind of then created this kind of 3 or 4 years where people really thought about things, and it's kind of almost that has radicalised people one way or another in different ways. And I suppose I do feel it frustrating that although I appreciate that it might not be to everyone's taste to go to Parliament Square, that's entirely fine, who are leavers, but there was such a wonderful atmosphere there, and so why it's been so frustrating that the last few days I've just spent the whole time on social media and in the media and in a seminar I was at fighting against people who said, oh, those knuckle-dragging fascists who were in Parliament Square, and I was with these people who were joyous and pleased and felt relieved, actually, not triumphalist, relieved that their vote hadn't been torn up. So I'm very excited. I also think I'm actually excited by the fact that there are different political discussions. I mean, you know, God, I'm bored stiff now. Everyone talking about the bloody Northern Heartlands, but at least they've made their presence felt. You know what I mean? You can't move for discussions on coastal communities. But actually, that's quite good, because what it means is that places that nobody ever bothered taking any notice of, at least like now everybody, even though I think it's often superficial, at least that discussion's in there. I think on issues like immigration, my caution is, you know, that I might be very liberal on immigration personally, but I think that what the left and my peers on the left and what I have done over the years is to assume a moral righteousness about that and not convince my peers of it. And that's where we went wrong, right? I mean, you cannot impose it on. And the problem with freedom of movement as imposed by the EU was it was told, no debate, no discussion, this is the rules, you've got no say in it, and it doesn't matter whether you're frightened, discombobulated, culturally weird, and then you were labelled a racist. And that was my concern about the misuse of the term racism, not to undermine racist attacks or serious racism, but to say that when there's concern about certain issues, it doesn't automatically mean that people are backward, anti-foreigner or racist. And I'm sure that you'll know that a lot of the people who were concerned in Wood Green, where I live, about Polish immigration or Afro-Caribbean local residents and Irish local residents and so on, who felt discombobulated by a new, you know, so it's just more complicated is the point I'm making. Okay, final sentence. I think that what we need to do, this is your point, is we need to experiment politically. What I think has gone wrong is that we've got stuck, and if Brexit means nothing else, it means shaking up the status quo. And I think the political parties of old are not fit for purpose. I think that they're changing. I don't think the Tories are either. And I think that now is potentially an exciting period where one might go beyond left and right, at least, you know, start afresh and think, what do I really think now? And not get tied up with some dogma that one used to think 10, 15 years ago. Not be intimidated by what labels people might use against you, and try something new. And I think that the democratic experiment of Brexit allows all of us to do that. And that's therefore brilliant.
Can we thank all of our speakers?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between. Can we also give a round of applause to our chair, Ella Whelan, please? We want to thank all of you for coming and participating in the first London Symposium. So thank you for making that special and for allowing not just your thoughts but your faces to be recorded for tonight's event. We are now going to ask if you please do not feel that you have to stop the conversation, we are inviting you all to please go downstairs with your wristbands and continue your evening and your conversation. And those of us that just need to clean up will follow you down shortly. But before we do, could we give up one more big round of applause, please, for the Seckford, everybody here, and particularly David, for being our gracious host this evening. If you are interested in hearing more about the London Symposiums, and I didn't see you at the beginning to check your email, come find me. Or if you're a +1, so I don't have your name or your email address, come find me, and we will be gathering names for future events. Thank you so much, and I'll see you downstairs. Have a great 2020. Good luck.